Hello, One Book, One Norristown community. I'm Marty Miller. I'm one of the commissioners in West Norristown Township, right down the street from the beautiful Norristown Area High School. And I'll be reading part of Chapter 6 of Lorene Cary's novel, The Price of a Child. My fellow commissioner, Ms. Judith Eccles, will be reading the second half of the chapter. As a reminder of where we left off last week, here's a brief recap. Chapter number 5. In Chapter 5, Family, Ginny is convinced to take the name of Mercer as more suited to her new stature and assumes the name of Mercer Gray. Discussions and thoughts of childbirth begin the chapter. Mercer is temporarily housed with Aunt Bee and suffers the discomfort of numerous flea bites. Her son, Matty, develops a terrible fever, causing a change in plans. Although it is not considered safe for them to remain in Philadelphia because of reprisals from Jackson Pryor, Maddie's ill health necessitates that Mercer and her children stay at Bee's home in the shed. Harriet visits them and brings lessons for the children. She invites Mercer to attend a lecture on anatomy that she is presenting at her parents' home. Mercer also attends a service with the Quicks at the St. Thomas African Episcopal Church. As was feared, Pryor files charges, and Still and the Porters are arrested for assault and battery, while Williamson is imprisoned for contempt of court because he failed to produce Mercer when ordered to do so. And now, on to Chapter 6, which is called Happy Few. At breakfast the next morning, the Quicks argued about what to do with Mercer. Cary joked that they'd become as sentimental and as meddlesome as Gertrude Wren, the Vigilance Committee's old white widow, who wanted fugitives brought to meet her before they were sent on their way. She cherished their stories. She wept over their sufferings and laughed at the ruses they used to escape. Then, gleefully, she reached into her purse for a gold dollar coin to put into each palm. They tell me, Cary said, that she folds their fingers over that piece of money and then she just holds them like this. He pantomimed pressing the dollar into Africana's palm, closing her hand into a fist, and then cupping his two hands over hers. Or like this. Then he pulled her to him and smashed her face into his chest. "Oh, oh, oh, my dusky daughter," he said in falsetto. "My sable son. Oh, you faithful black husband and wife. Together you escaped. Together, after all. And with children. Tell me how the wind howled." "Well, it howled all right, ma'am. Didn't it howl? Howled something fierce." Manny grumbled that Mrs. Wren had an ample supply of gold coins. "Kind of money she has grows by itself," he said. "And every morning she wake up, she got more." "And where's it come from?" Sharkey asked rhetorically. "Her bankers probably invest in the very land that those same poor wretches escaped." Having received Cary's attention, Africana smiled. She adored and feared her father, Roland. Now she was warned not to be like him. Harriet wanted her to be more studious. Della wanted her to work harder in the house. Her mother wanted her to be quiet. She tapped Cary's sleeve. He patted her on the shoulder and turned to Sharkey. "We've got to move them north," Cary said. "Any white man who'll take the trouble to prosecute Williamson will see to it he hires better slave catchers than the government's half-wits." "All the more reason," Della countered, "to have them here where we can keep our eye on them." "No," Manny said to his wife. Della sucked her teeth. "I just feel better if we can keep an eye on them." "You keeping an eye on them won't keep them safe," Sharkey said. "We really must fetch Mercer if we're going to discuss her welfare and the children's," said Harriet. No one objected when she left to get her. "We should ask Mr. Still what to do," Blanche said. She watched her daughter pick through embroidery threads for a new strand. "Blanche, please talk to her," said Della. "Africana," Blanche said. "Do one color at a time." "Now, Blanche," Cary said. "What were you trying to say?" Blanche looked at the floor and mumbled. I said maybe we should ask Mr. Still about it. Harriet came into the kitchen. Mercer stepped behind her. With uncharacteristic roughness, Sharkey said, "Mercer, that man you were looking for that you were with on the ferry, he wouldn't call him her owner, and she appreciated him for it." "Jackson Pryor." "Right, Jack Pryor. Why do you smile?" "He wouldn't like us all to call him Jack. She'd call him Sir, and nothing else. Not Mr. Anything, never Master, nothing at all. No name, no words, nothing. In bed." "I cannot stand a noisy woman," he had said. She was silent, and it suited them both. "He's a jackass for what he's done. He's accused Williamson of larceny, and he's charged Still and 5 good men of assault and battery and riot, for God's sake. They should have took Jack the ass and threw him overboard. Can he swim? Sharky asked. I wouldn't know. And now Williamson's in prison because he's claiming quite truthfully that he doesn't know where you are and therefore cannot produce you in court, as he's been ordered to do by the slavery-loving judge. Tyree asked, how well do you know Pryor? Mercer shrugged. You know him like you know people when you're in service, Tyree, Harriet said. Will he go through with this campaign, Tyree asked. Will he back off? Mercer shook her head. No, sir, he won't back off. We'll leave y'all now. We should have gone earlier, but we'll head on north now, I guess up to Canada. That'll be best, don't you think? Della said, that boy of yours can't travel yet. I expect he'll have to. My mother's right, Miss Mercer, Tyree said. We can't stay here. I don't see why we can't talk to Mr. Still, Blanche repeated. She had earlier suggested that they take Williamson a basket of food. No one had responded. Tyree closed his eyes and rubbed them. There was Blanche again, looking for someone to take care of things. He told himself not to take it personally, but it irked him. It had to be why his brother had slapped her down and shouted, What I say goes. Tyree wouldn't hit her. He promised himself never to hit a woman when his father had knocked his mother into the lamp for nagging him. She'd caught on fire, and they had to hold her on the floor and roll her in the rug while she screamed. This time, Sharky frowned at Blanche. No, my dear, we do not talk about this to Mr. Still. And he does not talk about this to Mr. Williamson. And we do not talk to Mr. Williamson. The only thing saving both of them right now is the fact that they can honestly say that they do not know where Mercer is. Giving them that knowledge would be a great disservice. Oh, Blanche looked hurt. In a few moments, she slipped upstairs. Africana followed her. After a time, Tyree went to find Blanche in her room, where she was sewing with her daughter. Why is she by the window getting the best light, and you're here on the bed? Africana, go around and collect Etta and get to school. Your Aunt Harriet has already gone. Blanche got up off the bed and sat in her customary chair. Besides, if you sit up on that bed all day, your back will give out. You know that. I'm a ninny, she said. No, you're not, said Blanche. To the contrary, you are willful in the extreme, and once you've insisted on your own way, and someone pushes back with equal force, you go in the corner and cry. You always call me willful. He raised an eyebrow. How was I willful, Tyree? Stupid, maybe. I see that now. Uncle Sharky showed everyone how stupid I was, she said bitterly, but how willful? I told you that it wouldn't do to talk to Still. You tried to override me. She kept sewing. What is it? She cried silently and sewed. What? Now you're angry at me, too. She stopped sewing and gave herself up to weeping. Yes, now I am. I'm not a good wife. I'm not a good mother. I know that. Tyree refused to reassure her at this time. He was tired of reassuring Blanche. Africana's a lazy little girl, she said. If Tyree did not console her and make up to her, she'd drag out every failing in her life and the life of anyone she could claim. She's not little anymore, Blanche, and I cannot make her better. And Cyrus would rather be with you. He'd rather be with anyone. Blanche, why don't you give up these damn furs? Aunt Zilphy's right. I think they're affecting you. They're making you morbid. Please don't take away my business, Tyree. We'll start you in another business. I couldn't do anything half as well as I do this. Tyree found it hard to argue with Blanche on the subject of the furs. It was the only endeavor she'd ever pursued diligently, and she did indeed make her own money. He had stopped wishing Blanche were other than she was, and he had stopped rehearsing her few virtues to himself. He'd made a mistake. He'd married with his pants instead of his head. He snatched her up, thinking that the years of coveting his brother's wife signified more than mere covetousness, and supposing that he would find pleasure in trying to make up for his brother's mistreatment of her. He'd learned that Blanche had not been miserable because of Roland, although Roland had done her ill. Her innermost core had a puddle of misery that never dried. We do the best we can, eh? Tyree passed his fingers under her chin. Then he left, grateful for sunshine and a chilly blue sky. He headed for Waverly Street. Sally had taken ill and moved in with her brothers, so her house had come vacant. Tyree decided to enhance it by digging out the cellar to make another full room. Sally's husband had left her enough money to keep the house by herself, but Tyree could charge twice the rent and provide decent accommodations by housing 2 or 3 families in the house, with the basement addition. Manny had suggested putting on a shed. Sheds were fast to build, but they took weather badly and they were cold in winter. He began to shovel. It was harder than he thought, because he could not stand up until he shoveled down a foot. He knelt and shoveled into a bucket. Then he dragged the bucket to the window, which was at street level, and dumped it. When Nignag grinned into the window, asking for work, Tyree accepted. Because Tyree could shovel faster than Nignag, he set up a system that let him move dirt from the back of the cellar to a mound at the front, where Nignag shoved it out the window. They tied handkerchiefs around their faces to keep out the dust. They didn't talk. Before the arrest, Tyree had toyed with the idea of installing Mercer and her children in this house. He liked her near him. He knew good and well that he wanted her, and that if she stayed with them, he'd try to eventually have her. Tyree had kept his marriage vow, but he entered his 30s now, and it was beginning to look like he'd be shoveling clay in rat-pissy cellars for the rest of his life, married to a woman who would never be a partner. The abundance of feeling he had when he first seen Mercer had not diminished. He thought of her in the mornings, when he awoke, and in the evenings when he had eaten and washed. And he felt a rich joy in her presence, as he had now and then as a child with a special friend. He never felt quite so much for a woman before. Of course Jackson Pryor wanted to get her back, the son of a bitch. Why wouldn't he? The work was dirty and repetitive and hard. The soil in the cellar was damp and heavy. Tyree thought about the arrest of the porters who helped Mercer escape. He remembered the gentleness of their restraining hands. He couldn't help but think about the more famous cases he'd followed since the enactment of the Fugitive Slave Law in 1850. Anthony Burns had been arrested in Boston and marched to the jailhouse by federal officers. The plan to liberate him from prison failed, and he was impounded by the government like so much freight and sent back. And then there was Solomon Northrop, a freeman who wrote a book that described how he was stolen, sold into slavery, and worked for 12 years until his wife and friends in the North were able to track him down and free him. Harriet and Tyree and Sharkey had worried about these and other cases ever since Mercer's arrival, and yet scores of escapees lived in their midst. In the Cedar Ward, in the tree-named alleys like Juniper, where Nignag lived, renting half a room and hiring themselves out for dirty and dangerous work, where nobody asked their names or where they came from. Others moved to the countryside and slipped into the quiet lives of other Negroes or of white Quakers and Presbyterians who were happy to acquire good workers cheap and to give a principled discretion in return. Tyree stepped out of the basement into the October afternoon. He washed his hands under the pump in the alley and cajoled Nignag to do the same before he share his lunch with him. They didn't bother to wash their faces, so the two of them sat opposite each other with striped mugs as they gulped their food. When Tyree took out the boiled potato that Zilpha had packed for him, she refused to eat Bella's rich cooking. He got an idea. Mercer could stay in Westchester with his aunt. The boy, or maybe both children, could stay with the Quicks, and with their group broken up like that, they'd be harder to spot. The more Tyree turned the idea in his mind, the more he liked it. By the end of the afternoon, he was stiff and tired, but happy. It occurred to him to stop on the way home and buy her something. At first, Zilpha refused. She'd been with the family in Philadelphia since Manny's last stroke, and she looked forward to returning alone to her cottage. Finally, frustrated by her aunt's resistance, Harriet asked whether Zilpha wanted them to pay a lodger's fee on Mercer's behalf. I wouldn't give that, Zilpha snapped her fingers, for your fee, but now that you made me appear mean, I'll take her till Christmas. So you better hope they get things resolved, because you'll have her back for the new year and no children. They made arrangements quickly. Mercer agreed that breaking up the family group described in the newspaper account would help confound any spies. Etta would continue her studies and live with Bea. Maddie would stay in Tyree's household and go to school with Cyrus. Mercer would live and work with Zilpha until she could secure a situation of her own in the country and send for the children. As always, they'd watch for events and write in case of any change. Who could tell how their lives might be altered? Once she had packed her few things, Mercer took a tray of supper to Bea, who was sewing in the late afternoon light of her bedroom. Mercer waited as Bea put aside her work and fussed with her napkin. She liked being waited on. What am I going to do without you, my old friend? She asked. Mercer smiled and went downstairs to her children, who were waiting by the stove in the kitchen. She told them the latest plans. They were both quiet, at once fearful and expectant. Then she served them bowls of bean soup and a biscuit. They were handsomer children than the two frightened urchins she had brought into this house. In only 3 weeks they had taken on the sharp-eyed look of their new, free peers. Mercer reached around the table and rubbed first Etta's cheek and then Maddie's. "I'm going to make us some money while I'm away," she said, "and then we can find our own house to live in." For reasons she could not fathom, Mercer felt trust. Tentative, temporary, but as comforting as the fire in the stove. She did not want to leave them, especially not after these weeks that had been more tender than any they'd had together, but she could do it because she believed her own words. "May we go now?" Earlier, Cyrus had come to tell the children that Della was making pudding from the bread and cakes left over from last week's catering. Before they ate, however, the children were required to do their lessons and chores. They went with Phoebe and Jane, the young boarders. Zilpha got into bed, as always, promptly at 7. Going upstairs to fetch Bee's tray, Mercer smelled Zilpha's pipe smoke. Bee had fallen asleep in her chair. When Cary came upon Mercer washing up in the kitchen, she was alone. He'd brought a small trunk and traveling bag and a covered bowl of pudding. The bag was made of brown cloth with wide leather straps that had darkened and softened with age. "You don't have a proper valise, do you?" Mercer laughed out loud. She packed her things in a bleached tea crate. "No, Mr. Cary, I didn't bring me a proper valise. I did have a trunk like that. Well, not so fine, but that size. For my things and the children, but, as you know." "You did not have time to collect it at the docks. Yes, I recall you were in a hurry." Cary took his time to study her face up close. She was not pretty, as people use the word. Instead, her face looked taut and powerful. "In my family," he said, "I'm afraid there's not much time just to be nice and quiet like this." "Did Miss Blanche help you pick this out, or Miss Harriet?" "No, my wife, sends her best for your journey, and she'd agree with me that we couldn't let you go with your things stuffed into a tea crate." "No, sir, your wife don't give a damn if I go or stay." He looked into her eyes. She did not shrink. He threw back his head and laughed. "Well, truth to tell, she'd just as soon see I go." "Not without reason," Cary said. She turned her head away from him. Her hair had been pulled back hard into a bun. It made tiny waves from her temples, like an ocean at night. Cary would bet that she'd never seen the ocean. It pleased him to imagine taking her to Cape May in the summer and kissing her under the black sky while the black ocean made shiny black waves next to them like her hair. Mercer felt Cary brush his fingers over her head and rest them for a moment on the nape of her neck. "I love this family like a child would love a family that took her in out of the cold, Mr. Cary. What you do is your business, but I don't want to do nothing to hurt anybody here." "We're not hurting anybody." Slowly enough that Mercer saw it coming, Cary turned her toward him, bent his face towards hers, and brushed her mouth with a kiss. Had he done it more, or done it with force, she would have pushed him away, but he hadn't. He'd gone nice and slow, and then she met him halfway. "This isn't right," she said. He looked at her steadily. He hadn't thought about Pryor until this afternoon, when he admitted to himself that he wanted her. He hadn't wished to know. He didn't like to think what she'd done before him, even though he was a grown man and she'd passed the first bloom and a mother. Maddie was a honey color, but not too light. Maybe nothing had happened, but why else would he have let her bring her children at all? A lot of things aren't right, but we all do them, don't we? We do them because we tell ourselves we have to, or we do them because we don't know any better. Yep. The more he wanted her, the more he knew that Pryor had been there first. Black man can't have anything to himself. He yearned to push back her past, just roll it away and have all of her, pure and smooth as skin, for himself. If he could get a hold of Pryor, he'd grab him by the lapels and ram him against the wall. Just ram him, until he quenched his thirst for injury. He felt like shaking Mercer and screaming at her for letting him do it, for not refusing, for not saying she'd rather die than submit and bear little honey-colored babies. Cary dropped the hand he'd been holding and sucked in his breath. Thank you for the bag, she said. Thank you for the trunk and for everything you've done for me. I owe you. Poor Merce, he thought. Did she think she owed him? He was sorry that bloody-mindedness had rushed in to spoil his precious time with her. I owe you, he said. He left. Instead of going home, he turned at the end of the block toward Sharkey's to tell his uncle that he'd like to drive to Westchester. Mercer's presence, from the moment he'd seen her on the ferry boat, had disturbed his brain. The way a September storm would make rats leave their tunnels and scritch crazy in chimney walls. She disturbed him. She'd upset his careful life and disciplined contracts with everyone around him. The events of Tyree's life cut loose like fighting cocks, and memories flew up in his face, looking to draw blood. Tyree remembered his father taking him and Roland, just the boys, although Harriet stood at the door and cried to go, to the place where the Wissahickon Creek emptied into the Schuylkill River. He remembered how he and his brother would wait at the mouth of the creek while Manny swam out to the rock in the middle of the river. The boys splashed up the backwater, looking for beavers. They swam out into the river just 6 or 8 feet, which was as far as they dared. In the long minutes when his father disappeared behind the rock, Roland would get right up to Tyree's ear and hiss the unutterable. Maybe he's drowned. And they'd fix their eyes on the east side of the rock where the tide caught in a smooth V. They watched, terrified to think of Manny dead, and terrified to think their own titillation as a thought. Then their father's head burst through the surface of the water, orange and brown in the sunset, and when he snapped his face upward to suck at the air, they could see a swirl of water and the glint of his teeth. Tyree sighed relief, and Roland tripped his tongue each time nature failed to rhythm of their father. Sure enough, Manny would return, so vigorous and self-satisfied that Roland would inevitably sulk, and Manny would inevitably beat him. He beat him with a green switch in the water where it would sting. Roland writhed and thrashed but refused to cry, and Manny would lay on quick, hard strokes. They turned the creek bed to a muddy brown. Tyree ran and held onto his mother, and Manny would beat him too. Then they'd dress and walk to town, where Manny would leave the boys with little Bee, who'd assure him that she was not drunk, and that she would not get drunk, while Manny went down the block to his shed kitchen woman. He returned in an hour, trailing a vague patchouli smell and promising Bee something for her trouble. On each occasion, scores of them. Roland had wished his father dead. Now Roland was dead. Tyree didn't know why, but Mercer's coming to the Quick household, Mercer's leaving, brought it all back to him fresh. If she asked about his brother, Roland rose up, sulkily by his side. If she asked about the way north, he thought about his trips to Thetford Academy in Vermont, where they'd been kind to his brother and himself, and where he'd learned algebra and geometry, Latin and French, science and English literature. She'd asked one night what he liked best in school, and he recalled learning monologues and reciting them at the Philadelphia Library Company of Colored Persons, where he and Roland had first met Blanche. He remembered seeing his effect on the people in the audience and feeling his own new manhood reflected bright as sunlight. He'd been 17. We happy few, he began, that fly his fluid voice and warlike hope. The recitation stayed in his mind, each word remembered. We band of brothers, for he today that sheds his blood with me shall be my brother. Be he ne'er so vile, this day shall gentle his condition. And gentlemen in England now abed shall think themselves accursed they were not here, and hold their manhoods cheap, whiles any speaks that fought with us upon St. Crispin's day. Words about ragtag adventurers who lived and died centuries before seemed fresh and new when Tyree spoke them, as if they'd been written on purpose to describe the free colored people of Philadelphia. Black Americans who'd lain abed, figuratively speaking, in the mid-1800s would wake up one day, and like Britons of the Middle Ages, they would hold their manhoods cheap, because they had not been part of the advance guard, fighting, organizing, petitioning, meeting, working, conniving to rid the United States of slavery's canker, and to cheat America of every red cent they could steal away from the slave trade and its slick profiteers. Mercer's smile like her resistance at the dock, called forth in him long-neglected passion that had once told him who he was. The old people had a phrase, naturally manhood. That's what they said he had, not just usefulness or cleverness with his hands, not a smooth, sharp tongue, not even good looks or strength, or a particular portion of courage or goodness. Naturally manhood gleamed. It wrapped a playful, quick, dangerous manliness around a core of integrity. Roland had always been older, handsomer, and smarter, wasn't he? Wasn't it he, after all, who'd been called to the front of the class to sight read a passage of Pliny the Younger when the vice president came to Philadelphia, having wagered a friend that no N word could really read Latin? But Roland had lacked Tyree's humor. Roland had little love in him and never any give. That's why Roland went so hard after the Africa scheme. That's why once he decided he'd given no one, not even his wife Blanche, time to get used to it. It was why he badgered Manny for money to go, and why Blanche had run away from him, taking their baby daughter Africana, as he'd insisted on naming her, but had broken down into a tiny bundle of tears outside Zilpha's whitewashed home in Westchester. It was why they had sent for Tyree to come get her instead of her own husband. Roland would have beaten her something awful. Roland had no give. But that had happened a long time ago. Tyree wished Mercer had known him then. He wished she had known him before he'd followed Blanche on an impulse into the basement and made her his own. Tyree remembered how he gathered up her skirts with one hand and then pulled down her drawers with the other. He felt again the shocking softness of her thighs and the curve of her buttocks, and more shocking, her easy submission. He felt again that handful of buttery flesh. He remembered how he squeezed and rolled it in his hand before he took her, there in the basement, his brother's wife, from behind, and how shocked she'd been when he bent her over for it. Roland must have always taken her from the front, he laughed to himself. Roland had no imagination. Tyree wished that he'd met Mercer before all that. She made him yearn to be more virtuous. It was an old-fashioned idea, quaint. He had to smile at himself. She made him wish to be a political man again, the man with notions, who never veered from them. She also made him feel lusty, as if lust for integrity went hand in hand with the violence and thrust of his body. Tired of thinking, tired of yearning, Tyree slipped in his house and up the stairs into Blanche's room. The lamplight slanted in on her. She was bent over, sewing a bit of gray fur onto the brim of a large gray hat and wearing her chemise as he knew she would be. Coiled on the top of her head was her braid. It was the color of creek water, like her eyes. Coppery little naps rolled themselves into curls on the nape of her neck. Creek-colored puffs of wet hair peeked out from her armpits. The room was hot and close. She kept a little heater going. It smelled like Blanche and kerosene and the pelts. Outside, Knick-Knack could be heard braying and coughing in the alley. Tyree had paid him for the day's work. No doubt he'd used it for ale, now wanted some food. Blanche looked up at her husband. You sick? No, I'm not sick. Oh, she said, looking out at the last strands of angled sun. You're early. No, I'm not, he said. You've lost track of time. I'll be down directly. I'm not going down, Tyree sighed. How are you this afternoon, he asked. His wife looked at him and coughed and laughed. I'm quite well, thank you. Tyree walked over to where she sat on her chair. He began to pick up the pelts and brush leather. Oh no, she said, please don't disturb those. I've just tacked them on. He sucked his teeth impatiently. Blanche pouted and bent over the piece of hat she'd been working on. Tyree didn't look into her eyes. He knew that they'd been watery red from fur and fatigue. He didn't want to see them. Instead, he bent Blanche over so he could watch as he slid his fingers over the spiny tips on her back and around to her breasts. Mouse titties, that's what Manny had called them years before, and Roland had told his father to never say it again because he was going to marry her. But the phrase had stuck in Tyree's head. He even teased himself about it. He rubbed the chemise over the sweaty little mouse titties. The third floor was hot. Blanche yielded as she always did. The yielding was subterfuge. He'd learned that over the years as he ceased to tremble with the larcenous thrill of having her, just having her with her creamy skin and her creek-colored hair spilling over the pillow like a picture book vision, just having her to take as he had first, 2 or 3 times in a night whenever he awoke hard and horny, reveling in her tiny cries, just having to feel her under the coverlet, the white coverlet she'd embroidered for months, then patched and quilted after Roland had come home and bled into it like a stuck pig, as Della always said. Just having her like this, strong-smelling, sticky, yielding, she yielded, but she retreated to some inner chamber of her most secret self, far away from him. She thought he didn't know, but he knew. When he began to hate her for it, the year that Cyrus was born, it was his mother who took him aside to tell him that Blanche couldn't help how she was. It seemed as if she might, but she couldn't. Then Della reminded him that no matter how she was his wife. She was family. She was doing her best, Della had pointed out. Della, who could barely abide her, and it was Blanche's fault if she failed to please him? Cary trailed his finger down the fine mist on her back and pulled her chemise up to her waist. Blanche said nothing. The lamp threw a gold glow onto her gold flesh. She preferred to do her duty, as she said, in the dark. But he liked to see it. He grabbed the tiny curve of her buttocks and took her there from behind, as he'd done in the basement years before. And he felt the warmth from her heater on the backs of his thighs and her shaking flesh in the front. That concludes my reading of this portion of Chapter 6. As I previously mentioned, Commissioner Judith Eccles will take over with the conclusion of Chapter 6. I hope you enjoyed it.